So it's my distinct honor to introduce General Mike Murray, the Commanding General of Army Futures Command. General Murray commands Sergeant Major Crosby and distinguished guests from around the world representing organizations in the Army, DoD, civilian agencies of the U.S. government, academia, and our industry partners. Welcome to the first event in an iterative collaboration between Army Futures Command and West Point's Lieber Institute. This iterative collaboration will explore the future character of war and its implications to the application of law of armed conflict and American warfighting ethics. For those of you who don't know General Murray, our commanding general here, just want to have just a quick introduction short introduction to his career and why his leadership has been instrumental to getting this collaborative event and this collaboration between AFC and Lieber Institute off the ground with his great support. In 1982, General Murray was commissioned as an infantry officer upon graduating from the Ohio State University. Since then, he has served in the Army for 39 years, commanding at every level from company to division and joint task force levels. As brigade commander of 3rd Brigade, 1st Cavalry Division, he served with 2 fellow brigade commanders, at the time colonels, now General Mike Milley, the current CJCS, and General McConville, the current Chief of Staff of the Army. From 2015 to 2018, General Murray was the Army's Deputy Chief of Staff for G8, that's resource management. And it was during this tenure as the Army GA that under the direction of General Milley, the CSA at the time, General Murray and other senior leaders stood up the Task Force Futures to drive Army modernization under one command. In 2018, the Army stood up Army Futures Command here in Austin, Texas, and the Army assigned General Murray as its first commanding general. Army Futures Command under General Murray leads a continuous transformation of Army modernization in order to provide future warfighters with the concepts and capabilities needed to dominate the future battlefield. Ultimately, AFC and General Murray are charged with unifying and driving the Army's modernization enterprise, inject a sense of urgency into capability development, and be a disruptor to the status quo. As the AFC SJA for almost a year, I have seen firsthand the care and thoroughness that General Murray takes before making every decision, from decisions affecting individual soldiers to enterprise-wide decisions and modernization decisions that affects not only the Army, but DoD. In the modernization mission, General Murray fully understands the need to analyze and understand the legal implications of the evolving Army concept and capabilities, and to incorporate the law of armed conflict and American warfighting ethics into Army modernizations. Since the Lieber Institute and AFC-OSJ first presented him the idea for an AFC and Lieber Institute collaboration on the future character of war and the LOAC, General Murray has been a full-throated supporter. General Murray then jumped at the chance to speak here personally and give you his thoughts on the future character of war and its implication for the law of war and American warfighting ethics. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, General Mike Murray.
Hey, Jose, thanks. Can you see me and hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So Jose is way too kind. And one of my greatest claims to fame in the last 2.5 years is I do have my SGA saying "the" in front of Ohio State University. So that's a pretty big accomplishment to train your SGA. And that's the first time I've ever heard anybody talk about OIF experience with General McConville and General Milley, but you actually missed one. So the other person that was also one of the brigade commanders was General Abe Abrams, currently USFK commander. So it was a pretty remarkable experience to serve with those gentlemen as fellow brigade commanders. So, you know, and Jose is absolutely right. So it was pre-COVID. It was probably close to 1.5 years ago, my last trip to West Point, where we sat down and talked about this opportunity. And it's been a long time coming, and I'm really glad to see that it's now here, because you're going to hear from a lot of people over the rest of the presentations in terms of the future of warfare, how we think about it, the future operational environment, future concepts, future technology. And I would just tell you that we spend a lot of time thinking about all of those things. And I want you to picture back when I was a brigade commander, even when I commanded the 3rd Infantry Division in Afghanistan, where decisions, life and death decisions were being made just about every day. And it usually was around either depending on how far back you go, a real map board or some sort of digital display. And the 3 was there, the 2 was there, usually the fire support officer was there. And you know, one of the key people standing around that map board of that display was the SJA. And as you worked your way through courses of action about do I apply lethal effects? Do I respond? You know, whatever it is that course of action was, you know, the lawyer always got to say, is this a viable course of action given the law of armed conflict, given the law of land warfare? Is this a legal response? And usually those discussions would take, you know, some time. I think in the future, when you hear about what we think about in terms of what that future operational environment looks like, the opportunity to get people around a map board and have a detailed discussion to include discussions about the legality of the actions you're contemplating as a commander, I think will be few and far between, if existent at all. And so that's what I'm really excited about this partnership, is I think there's a lot of things we're going to have to think through before we get to that point where a commander is contemplating in action and considering the legal consequences of that action. And so dialogue early on in this process as we begin to think through. And I looked at some of the proposed questions and concerns, and I think you're all spot on in terms of the things we need to be thinking about. So as you think about that future operational environment, and we've got publications on it, we've got videos on it, but you know, it's not correct. And that's one of the things that I always say when you talk about the future is first thing you have to do is admit you're probably going to be wrong. But you just have to be more right than wrong. But you know, as we think about this, we think about things like hyperactivity. So things occurring at incredible speeds. We think of things like sensor saturation. So the ability to hide from the amount of sensors that are going to be on a future battlefield. If you think about a battlefield where everything becomes a sensor, from space, from air, and on the ground, the ability to hide is going to be almost impossible. We think, you know, urbanization is going to drive us to more and more megacities worldwide. So the possibility that we will be fighting in dense urban areas is very, very high. We think about the things like the amount of information that's going to be available to a commander is not going to go down. It's only going to exponentially increase over time in terms of how much information a commander is going to have to consider. We think of highly lethal systems, not just owned by nation states, but with the dispersion of technology, the rapid dispersion of technology, you know, high-tech systems are not going to be just in the domain of nation states. And even if it's the domain of a nation state, it's going to be rapidly sold, and that technology dispersion is going to happen very, very fast. And as an example of that, I mean, so the third offset, GPS and precision guided weapons, gave us a significant advantage for a long period of time. There will be some first adopter advantages, but it will dissipate very, very quickly. So that's just some of the things that we think about, you know, in that future operational environment, which is one of the 4 primary tasks that AFC was given. And the follow-on task would be, okay, so what is the concept for the United States Army as part of the joint force fighting alongside our closest allies and partners? What does that concept look like that we're going to have if we're going to survive and operate in that future operational environment? And I would just say that, you know, multi-domain operations right now is in the process of being transitioned into doctrine. Colonel Ahern is going to talk to you later about the concept as we think of it beyond 2035. But technology will play a key part of that. And you know, I always talk about 3 key technologies. And once again, I am probably wrong. And I'm going to tell you these 3 technologies, and a lot of people on the net are going to say, well, they're already here. And that's true, right? So things like artificial intelligence is here. But it's not to the scale we need it, and it's not really to the in Austin, Texas. There are trucks running up and down the roads in California that are robotic and autonomous. So yes, it's all here, but not at the scale and not the maturation that we need it, because the key difference in autonomy and robotics is down the road or cross country. So we're working on those things, but they are here, but not at scale. But then, if you think about a sensor-rich battlefield, you think about the speed at which decisions are going to have to be made. And you hear General McConville talk about really 5 key words, and he says speed, range, convergence, and that's convergence of effects across all 5 warfighting domains. And he talks about decision dominance, and he says those are the things that we need to achieve overmatch and maintain overmatch going into the future. And the speed is really an interesting, from a warfighting perspective, speed is really an interesting concept. And it really, because this is what we get paid to do, is how fast can you deliver lethal effects? And how fast can you deliver lethal effects in a not only legal but ethical way? And how can algorithms, artificial intelligence, machine learning, eventually quantum, increase that level of speed? So we did Project Convergence, a thing called Project Convergence down at Yuma last fall, and it was a very simple learning opportunity experiment to really explore that problem. And I would just tell you, without going into all the details, we went from a process that normally takes tens of minutes and got it down, in best case, to tens of seconds. That's going to happen across the battlefield. And we're going to have to learn to trust artificial intelligence. And now the fine line becomes, the human in the loop, on the loop, or off the loop. And I think that's a great topic to discuss today, because I think it's more nuanced than just that simple question. And if you think about things like a drone swarm of, let's just say, 100 mesh network, semi-autonomous or autonomous drones, some lethal, some sensing, some jamming, some command and control to control that swarm. Think back to the closing ceremony of the Seoul Olympics. Is it within a human's ability to pick out which ones have to be engaged first and then make 100 individual engagement decisions against a drone swarm? And is it even necessary to have a human in the loop if you're talking about effects against an unmanned platform or against a machine? And in many ways, we do that already. So if you think about things that systems, if you've been to Iraq and Afghanistan, you're familiar with, called CRAM. I mean, CRAM engages off a radar hit. And it shoots down missiles, rockets, and artillery shells. And if it senses a conflict in its radar image, it shuts down and then re-engages when that conflict goes away. Our Patriots, our air defense systems, have the ability to be put on auto engagement, and it's a human decision to take it off auto engagement. This is open for debate, but I fundamentally believe that there are cases, nuanced cases, where humans just won't be able to keep up with the threat that's presented. Where I draw a line is, and this is, I think, well within our current policies, and probably will be within our current policies into at least the near future, if not far future. If you're talking about a lethal effect against another human, I think you have to have a human in that decision-making process. And my example down at Project Convergence, we did. It was mostly 90% machine to machine, but before that fire mission went to the gun line, there was a human that said, "Yeah, I agree with everything the machine says. Send that message, that TIDAT message, to the gun line." And that another word that I mentioned, this concept of decision dominance, which will be part of the multi-domain operations doctrinal publication, the ability to sense first, to understand first, to decide first, which gives you the ability to act faster than a future opponent and then do a reassessment, I think is going to be a significant significant advantage to any commander on a future battlefield. That we have got to figure out ways to do that, to act faster, make better decisions, not perfect decisions, better decisions faster, act faster than any future opponent on that battlefield. And will there be mistakes made? Absolutely. Just like the chaos of war, there will always be mistakes made. And I do think in sitting here in Austin, particularly, one of the first events that I did down here in Austin was a thing called South by Southwest, which is a very liberal gathering here in Austin. And we had some conversations on artificial intelligence and the ethics of the military application of artificial intelligence. And what I like to tell people is now is the time to be having these debates because ultimately, you know, as the United States Army, we operate under policy and we are bound by policy that is established by our lawmakers. And our lawmakers are the people's representative. And so now is the time to have the debate, not only here in Austin, Texas, but I think really around this country, because this debate is not going on in other countries. This debate is not going on in China. This debate is not going on in Russia. And when you talk about things like decision dominance and the speed and the increased ranges that we're working on, this is not something you want to be second or third in. And most importantly, this debate needs to go on because I never want to use any of the things we're developing, because ultimately this is about having the capability and the readiness that our opponents wake up each and every day saying today's not the day. So that deterrent effect of what they think the United States military, the joint force, with our allies and partners, is capable of, they don't want to take that on. You know, they're not certain today is the day that they can win. And so that's really what AFC is about. And it's not about just the technology. It's about how that technology is going to change the way we fight. It's about, beginning to build trust in some of these systems. And to make things even more complex, it's not just about conflict. It's about competition, and it's about competition, crisis, and conflict. So, and we're in competition right now. You just look what is going on in the press, what's going on around the world with nation states. I mean, we're in competition each and every day. The first thing I normally say is, competition is not an Army-only game. It's got to be a whole of government effort if we're going to engage in the competition that's going around the world. I mean, you don't have to look very far. South China Sea, Taiwan Straits, on the Ukrainian border, the cyber issues that we've got in this country right now in terms of the not only the attacks, but the draining of intellectual property from our defense industrial base, from our universities, and really from DOD itself. I mean, so we're in competition, the One Belt, One Road effort by China. We are in competition today. And so how do these tools, these concepts apply in competition as well as conflict? And in many ways, conflict is actually the easier thing to talk about. So because I promised Jose I'd take a couple questions, and I think I got like 10 minutes left, and then I got to go figure out the budget. But I think I'm just thrilled with this partnership, because I think this is the right place to have these types of discussions. You are the experts in terms of figuring out, or helping me figure out, what that future, what is possible from not only a legal standpoint, but from an ethical standpoint, from a policy standpoint on that future battlefield as we continue to develop these tools that are going to increase the speed of decision making to an incredible degree, as we extend the range of our weapon systems, as we really gain decision dominance and convergence across all 5 warfighting domains. And I'll cap that off by saying the Chief and I firmly believe that if you have those 4 things, that is the overmatch that we're seeking, and not only in the near future, but in the far future. And then, not for debate here, is really how do you transition the current force into that future force? Because we don't have 2 armies, right? So this is going to be a transition from what we have today into what we want out in the really first waypoint is really 2028, and then the aim point is 2035, and then how do we get out beyond 2035? And the chief says all the time, and we have one opportunity every 40 years to transform the Army. If you go back to the 40s leading up to World War II, a major transformation of the United States Army. And then most of you are not old enough to remember or not lived it. The transformation that occurred in the early 80s with the writing and really the final approval in 1986 of Air Land Battle and the Big Five, fielding the Big Five, the Abrams, Bradley, et cetera, plus a bunch of other systems in the early 80s. And here we are in 2020. So it's that 40-year mark. We've had the money to do this over the last 4 years in a fairly stable budget, thanks to two-year budget agreements. We'll see where we head in the future, but this is our opportunity to really transform the Army. And I'm going to say this, and I don't really mean it, for the next 40 years, because I do think that we have to do persistent modernization, more through software than hardware, but we have got to keep up with technology. And that's one of the things that we have failed to do over the last at least 40 years of modernization efforts, is really keep pace with technology as the rate of technological innovation continues to accelerate, and I believe will continue to accelerate well into the future. So Jose, I think I've got 9 minutes left, so I could probably talk the entire half day, but I'll stop there and see if you've got some questions for me.
Yes, sir. Sir, thanks for those great remarks. I'm very excited to hear your thoughts on all of this, and I think you provided a great scene setter for us. So we do have one initial question, and it's basically going back to your thoughts that you mentioned about AI and whether or not, or at what point or what types of war fighting is a human in the loop versus human on the loop versus other types of thing. The question is, what level of human control is ethical and practical versus human targets? For example, a human okaying every individual trigger pull, in other words, an individual okaying that, or just having some sort of AI framework that identifies the different criteria for who is a lawful target. Over.
So I think it's a very nuanced discussion, and I'm going to give you a nuanced answer, to be honest with you. So, and I'll start off by saying I really think that as I think about artificial intelligence, the most beneficial use of artificial intelligence is augmenting human decision makers, as opposed to making lethal decisions. But there are just some cases like the drone swarm I mentioned. And 100 small drones swarm that's here today. It's been demonstrated. There are nations around the world that are developing that capability. And you go back to Armenia, those weren't small drone swarms, but you can see the lethal effects that drones really can have, especially from the air. I think there are going to be things that happen that are outside the realm of, like you said, targeting each individual target. And I think we're going to have, and this is just Murray, that we're going to have to go there if these are autonomous systems, unmanned, let's call it unmanned systems. My ethic, maybe I'm too old school, my ethical underpinnings, the LOAC and the law, my 39 years of experience in the Army, my understanding of the ethics of the American people, our policymakers. If there's another human being at the end of whatever action you're contemplating, I think there's going to have to be a human making that final decision. And we've proven we can accelerate that. I used the sensor to shooter at Project Convergence. So there was a human that said, yes, send that data to the gun line before the lanyard gets pulled. That is a human in the loop. Now, will that be the case? Now, another thing about artificial intelligence is trust, right? And that's, it always amazes me. And Jose said I've been in the Army for 39 years. I grew up mostly in mechanized units. And I remember as part of the gunner skills test, we probably still do, use flashcards, just like I learned my math tables. right? And it's a T-72, it's a T-80, it's a T-90, it's a Sheridan, it's a Abrams tank, it's a Chieftain, it's a Challenger, it's a Merkava. And if a gunner got 80% correct, we put that 19-year-old young man, and now young man or young woman, behind a 120 millimeter smoothbore cannon and turn them loose. We have algorithms today on platforms we're experimenting with that can get to about 98.8% accuracy, right? So actually, artificial intelligence has the ability to make us more safe and make better decisions about what is a valid target and what's not a valid target with a human in the loop, because that algorithm just makes a recommendation. It automatically scans, it identifies, makes a call, just like some of the facial recognition software that you've seen about what is that, a T-72 or is that an Abrams tank, and then the trigger pull is up to that kid behind the cannon. But I think that's the power of artificial intelligence, is really, and I talked about this, is enabling human decision makers, especially, and I think at least for the near term and probably far into the future, when that decision involves taking another human life.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Great response. And just one quick follow on that question, on that response, sir. Sir, how, as you talk about AI and potentially in some situations making decisions, if they're making those decisions without a human in the loop, how does the legal enterprise writ large for the U.S. government, right? How do we incorporate LOAC into that? How does it happen?
I don't think it's not going to be that's, I go back to my example of my entire career. I stood around a map board, and the lawyer is always standing right there, and every once in a while I glance up to see if he had a worried look on his face or not. And that's not going to be possible, right? So especially if you're talking about, and I'll just use the same example again, drone swarms. I mean, you're not going to be able to make that, once you acquire a drone swarm and they're 3 kilometers out, you're not going to have, you're not going to have 30 seconds to stand around a map board and make those decisions. So, it's going to come down to, right now, DOD's policy on the use of artificial intelligence is good, but it's not nuanced. It basically says you're always going to have a human on the loop or in the loop. And I'm sure those aren't the right words, but that's the way I interpret it. And so that's why we need to have these discussions now, because the policy is going to have to accommodate something like, if you get further into the future, a drone swarm of 100 aerial drones accompanied by 100 ground drones, unmanned vehicles with 30 millimeter cannon, and it's one big mesh network. And some of the drones are lethal, some are jamming all of your communications, so you're not going to have the time to have these discussions when you acquire these things a kilometer out. And jamming your sensors, so you may not acquire them until they open engagement. That's coming. Either we get there first or somebody else gets there first, but first contact with robots and autonomy, ground and air, is coming. So that's why I think now is the time to have these discussions, because we're going to have to think about some of these things that could come, and that's what you're going to get for the rest of the day. And how do we write policy, not only for the Army, but for DOD, and really begin these conversations with our lawmakers so they understand, what's coming, so the policy can accommodate those types of things. And like I said, will there be mistakes? There are always mistakes, and we're never going to come up with anything that is guarantees there will not be mistakes made. And I think that's a false goal as we begin to talk about this. And hopefully this is just the opening conversation. I mean, I think we could have these conversations every quarter, every 6 months, at least once a year, but informally, we have to keep these conversations going, because we need your help in figuring out exactly how to answer that question you just asked me.
Yes, sir. And I think we maybe have time for one more quick short question. So the question is, transformation, we think we'll need quick and agile procurement tools So are the changes to the FAR, DFAR, AFARs, the new acquisition authorities like OTAs, are they sufficient to help speed up the procurement process as part of AFCU's mission? Over.
I think they're a great start, and I'd throw MTAs in there as well. But we got to continue to have this conversation. And just to be honest with you, there's people on the Hill that are beginning to have a little less comfort level with the authorities they've given us, and there's, in my opinion, there's an effort trying to claw back some of the authorities. We've been very successful using everything you just mentioned. The best example of a fielded system is enhanced night vision goggles, binoculars. So 2 tubes as opposed to 1. It's fused IR and thermal, so no requirement for ambient light. It comes with eventually an advanced sight for the individual weapon, and so you can actually sight your weapon through your goggles, so you can literally shoot around corners. We had a Marine E5 at Fort Riley lay on his back and engage 5 of 5 targets at 100 meters without ever exposing himself. And so that was from an ONS coming out of USFK to the 1st Brigade fielded and on their way to Korea, 23 months. And 23 months sounds like a long time, but I mean, that's light years faster than we've done other things. The Bradley is a great example. 1967, we had our first prototype, and we fielded the Bradley in 1983. But you know, then the question becomes, how do you keep up with that, right? So you just can't field the same thing for 20 years. IVAS is an integrated visual augmentation system, which is the leap ahead for not only night vision, but really synthetic training, given individual close combat forces the tools they need in terms of navigation, situational awareness. You can look at a sign in Russian and it translates it for you. I mean, but you know, how do you, so I said translates Russian, what if it's Chinese, right? You know, so, okay, we got Russian, what about China? So software upgrades, and so the hardware may not change significantly over the next 10, 15 years, but the software is going to be updated every 2 years. And so that's how we got to start thinking about modernization. Is we got to make things more software centric, less hardware centric. You know, when we build the Bradley replacement here in a few years, and we start getting prototypes, do you start with the box and then figure out the software that needs to go in to make that work, or do you start with the software and figure out how to build the box around it? So it's just a different way of thinking about things. But to answer your question, the authorities we've been given have been tremendously helpful, along with Miss Lord, who used to be the ANS at OSD, really not pulling programs up to her level as the milestone decision authority and pushing things back down to where we can create some agility and some speed has been exceptionally helpful. And I can't stop without saying, you know, the partnership between the acquisition community and the requirements community, and really that crossover and that supporting and supported roles and the changing nature of those roles over time has also helped us.
So, sir, thank you very much. And sir, so we're about 3 minutes over your time. I know I got to give you back time. So that's 180 seconds, which means I owe you 180 push-ups. You'll get those today, sir. And
release.
And release, that's right. Release push-ups. Sir, so anyways, if you have any final thoughts, but thank you very much for your time today.
Yep, and I know John tried to fool everybody, so it is actually a bit overcast in Austin today. So that background is pretty accurate. No, once again, I mean, this is a great event, and I think John said like 500 plus on. That's phenomenal. I have looked at the agenda. Unfortunately, I can't spend all morning with you. But I thank everybody that had any part of this whatsoever pulling this together, because we've been talking about this for 1.5 years or more, and I'm really thrilled to see it finally come to be reality. And so thanks to everybody that had any part of this whatsoever. And Jose, thanks for the time and effort I know you put into this, as well as John.